Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Boulder, Colorado, awoke to a mystery that would dominate headlines for decades. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, a child beauty queen with a smile known across pageants and local magazines, was found dead in the basement of her family's elegant home. The discovery came hours after a ransom note had been left behind, demanding money and promising her safe return. But instead of a kidnapping, detectives uncovered a crime scene that seemed staged, tangled and filled with contradictions. What followed was unlike any investigation in American history, an unsolved case where every clue seemed to contradict the last, where theories split the nation in half, and where justice remains elusive, nearly 3 decades later. Tonight, we retrace each step, each lead, and each haunting question in a story that refuses to rest. Boulder, Colorado, is a city framed by the Rocky Mountains, known more for its quiet affluence and scenic streets than for violence or crime. In December 1996, the Ramsey family lived in one of its upscale neighborhoods, a sprawling Tudor-style house, decorated with the warmth of Christmas lights. John Ramsey, a successful businessman, and his wife Patsy, a former beauty queen herself, had built what seemed like an enviable life. Their daughter JonBenét, just 6 years old, was the star of the household, blonde, poised, already crowned in pageants that placed her picture in magazines and parades. To outsiders, it was the picture of privilege and security. Christmas night, December 25th, unfolded like countless others in American suburbs. The Ramsey home was buzzing with activity, presents exchanged, relatives visiting, children winding down from the sugar and energy of the holiday. Patsy had reportedly been tired but cheerful, helping JonBenét into her bed after a day filled with festivities. The house settled into quiet. Outside, snow softened the streets, muting the world with its blanket of white. But by the next morning, everything had changed. At around 5:30 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey awoke and began her day, still wrapped in the fog of Christmas fatigue. Descending the staircase, she noticed something unusual sitting on the back steps leading into the kitchen. A ransom note, neatly placed, 3 pages long. The note was addressed to the Ramseys, written in a tone of menace and mockery. It demanded $118,000 for the safe return of JonBenét, a strangely specific figure, one that matched John Ramsey's recent work bonus almost to the dollar. Panic surged. Patsy screamed for John, clutching the letter, her voice echoing through the house. They raced to JonBenét's room, only to find it empty. Within minutes they dialed 911. The call that morning set into motion one of the most controversial investigations in American history. Boulder police responded quickly, but the handling of the scene would later be criticized as a textbook example of what not to do. Officers arrived and read the ransom note, advising the Ramseys not to call friends or family. Yet within hours the home was full of people, relatives, friends, even church members, moving freely through the rooms, contaminating what would later become one of the most scrutinized crime scenes of all time. Meanwhile, investigators attempted to secure the ransom. John Ramsey began preparing the amount, $118,000, ready to comply. Though strangely, no kidnapper ever contacted them with instructions for delivery. Hours passed, tension mounting, and still no word. It wasn't until later that afternoon that the search shifted inside the house itself. Detective Linda Arndt, one of the few officers still present, suggested John Ramsey perform a top-to-bottom sweep of the home. Accompanied by a family friend, John descended into the basement, opening a small storage room. There, behind a closed white door, he found JonBenét. The sight was horrifying. She was lying on the cold concrete floor, covered partially with a white blanket. Her wrists were bound, a garrote made from a paintbrush handle, and cord was tight around her neck. Her mouth was taped. John lifted her body and carried her upstairs, a father's instinct overriding police procedure. But in doing so he unknowingly disrupted vital evidence. The ransom note, the bound body, the brutal discovery in the basement, each detail seemed to push investigators in multiple directions. Was this a kidnapping gone wrong? A staged crime? An attack from inside the house? Or an intruder who slipped in unnoticed? From the very beginning, the case spiraled into confusion. By the time the coroner arrived, the scene had been trampled by too many feet. Friends and family moved through the kitchen, touched doors, poured coffee. JonBenét's body, once upstairs, was no longer in its original position. The chain of evidence was fractured, and detectives knew it. In the sterile world of crime investigation, where clarity is built from preservation, the Ramsey case began already compromised. Still, one fact was undeniable: a child was dead. The ransom note's bizarre length and detail made it one of the strangest ever collected in American crime. The garrote suggested planning and cruelty, and the house itself, with its maze-like rooms, became a puzzle of entry and exit points that detectives could not easily map. By the end of December 26th, Boulder police had a tragedy on their hands that was bigger than their experience, bigger than their resources, and quickly growing bigger than their town. The Ramsey home, once a place of Christmas lights and laughter, was now a stage for one of the most infamous mysteries in modern America. And while JonBenét's body had been found, the truth of how she died and who killed her was only beginning to blur. The ransom note left behind in the Ramsey home has become one of the most infamous documents in American true crime history. At 3 pages long, it was unusually lengthy for such a crime. Most ransom notes are short, blunt, and designed to communicate one thing: the demand. But this letter rambled. It taunted, it mocked, and it included details that immediately raised red flags for investigators. The note began with a strange salutation: Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey. It was not addressed specifically to John or Patsy, but rather formally, as though written by someone at a distance. Yet the contents revealed intimate knowledge of John Ramsey's finances. The demand was for exactly $118,000, eerily similar to the bonus John had received that year from his company. Such specificity immediately suggested the author had personal knowledge of the family. The note claimed to be from a small foreign faction, a phrase that puzzled investigators from the start. The language shifted erratically, sometimes stiff and formal, sometimes colloquial. The writer warned not to involve the police, but the Ramseys had already dialed 911. The note instructed John to place the money in a brown paper bag, in denominations of $100 and $20 bills, and await a call the following morning for instructions. Yet no such call ever came. Forensic analysis of the note revealed even more unusual details. It had been written with a pen and paper from inside the Ramsey home. Detectives discovered a practice draft on the same notepad, discarded in the house. This indicated the note had not been brought in by an intruder, but composed on-site, taking time and care within the very walls of the home. The handwriting was inconsistent, capitalization varied, some letters carefully drawn, others hurried. Experts debated whether the writer had been trying to disguise their style. The sheer length of the note was baffling. At over 370 words, it was filled with repetitions and unnecessary flourishes. It referenced John's business, implied knowledge of his corporate dealings, and included odd phrases like, "Don't try to grow a brain." To some investigators, the note read less like the work of a professional criminal, and more like an attempt at theater, an elaborate performance meant to distract from the truth. Handwriting experts were brought in. Their task: determine whether Patsy Ramsey, or anyone else in the household, could have written the note. Comparisons were made between Patsy's known writing samples and the ransom letter. The results were inconclusive. Some analysts noted similarities in certain letter formations and phrasing. Others argued the differences were significant enough to exclude her. The findings only deepened the divide between those who believed the crime was staged by someone inside the house and those who insisted on the intruder theory. For Boulder police, the note became the first major crack in the Ramseys' account. If a kidnapper had truly taken JonBenét, why leave such an absurdly long letter? Why demand such a specific amount of money? Why use supplies from inside the house? And why, above all, would a kidnapper leave behind the victim's body in the basement, just steps away from the family upstairs? The FBI, brought in early to assist, voiced skepticism. Agents noted that the letter's tone seemed theatrical, as though borrowed from popular culture. Indeed, investigators later found phrases in the note that bore striking resemblance to lines from movies, including Dirty Harry and Speed. This raised the possibility that the author had stitched together threats from Hollywood rather than drawing from real-world criminal experience. Despite its strangeness, the ransom note dominated the early narrative of the case. To the public, it was proof of a kidnapping gone wrong. To skeptics, it was evidence of staging. The Ramseys, in their interviews, insisted they had nothing to do with it. Patsy in particular denied writing it, maintaining that the very idea was absurd, but suspicion had already begun to creep in. Forensic analysis of the paper and pen offered little help. They were ordinary household items, impossible to trace. The fingerprints on the letter were smudged, or too indistinct to identify. DNA evidence was not yet advanced enough in 1996 to yield results from such material. Once again, investigators found themselves circling a key piece of evidence without being able to pin it down. As the case unfolded, the ransom note became less of a clue and more of a battlefield. Supporters of the intruder theory pointed to its threats and instructions as proof someone outside the family had orchestrated the crime. Critics countered that the letter's bizarre wording, its presence inside the home, and its needless length all screamed of a cover-up. Every theory about JonBenét's death had to contend with the ransom note. Was it the work of a sophisticated outsider, or an improvised attempt to disguise a crime of passion within the home? The answer, investigators realized, could define the entire direction of the case. By the end of that first week, the note had become both the centerpiece of the investigation and its greatest frustration. It seemed to reveal everything and nothing all at once, pointing in every direction, implicating no one conclusively, and as Boulder police would soon discover, the ransom note was only the first of many contradictions in a case that would spiral far beyond their control. From the outside, the Ramsey home looked like the embodiment of suburban security, a 7,000 square foot Tudor-style mansion with multiple levels, winding staircases, and dozens of rooms. It was a fortress of comfort. But inside those walls, on the morning of December 26, 1996, it became a labyrinth of contradictions. Police struggled to secure the scene. Friends and neighbors, summoned by the Ramseys in their panic, moved freely through the house. They touched doorknobs, wiped counters, even cleaned up dishes from the night before. Every step they took erased potential evidence. By the time detectives began their work, the Ramsey home was less a crime scene than a gathering place. The ransom note demanded silence and secrecy, yet the house was filled with voices and movement. Investigators watched helplessly as potential clues were trampled. Mistakes that morning would haunt the case forever. By early afternoon, tension had shifted from waiting for a kidnapper's call to something darker. The FBI agents assisting the Boulder police began to voice concerns. The note felt staged, the ransom demand bizarre, and no one had contacted the family for the money. One agent later admitted he felt from the very beginning that the crime had been staged inside the house. Detective Linda Arndt, left alone with the Ramseys at one point, recalled the suffocating tension. She later said she counted out the bullets in her gun, unsure whether the killer might still be in the house with them. That was the atmosphere in the Ramsey home. Confusion, suspicion, and fear thick enough to choke. And as you're listening right now, let me ask you something. Where are you, and what time is it? Are you sitting in your room late at night, the lights low, feeling the weight of a story that refuses to let go? Or are you hearing this in the daylight, perhaps distracted by other things, yet drawn into a mystery that has baffled investigators for decades? Wherever you are, let this thought settle in. That very house full of people that morning might have held the truth all along. When John Ramsey discovered JonBenét's body in the basement, the fragile investigation unraveled further. Carrying her upstairs in a burst of grief, he unknowingly contaminated what should have been the most crucial evidence site. Paramedics later noted how chaotic the scene became. Family members wailing, friends rushing to comfort, officers trying to hold order in a place where order had already collapsed. Autopsy results confirmed what investigators feared. JonBenét had died from strangulation, the garrote around her neck a device designed with chilling calculation. She had also suffered a skull fracture, a brutal blow to the head delivered with immense force. The question was which injury had come first and why. The dual nature of her injuries suggested both a moment of violence and a prolonged attempt to control or stage the death. Forensic teams scoured the house, looking for signs of forced entry. Windows, doors, and locks were inspected. One basement window was found broken, but dust and cobwebs around it suggested it hadn't been used recently. There were no footprints in the snow outside, despite claims from some neighbors of a mysterious man spotted in the area. The lack of evidence supporting an intruder theory troubled detectives deeply. Still, the public narrative split almost immediately. One camp believed an intruder had broken in, written the note, and killed JonBenét before fleeing undetected. The other camp pointed to the bizarre note, the lack of forced entry, and the chaotic handling of the scene as signs that the crime had been staged by someone inside the house. From day one, the case became not just a whodunit, but a question of perspective, intruder or insider. Boulder police leaned toward the latter. FBI analysts, handwriting experts, and behavioral profilers agreed. Yet, without definitive proof, suspicion could not become prosecution. The house was filled with possibilities, but no single truth. As night fell over Boulder on December 26th, one fact loomed larger than all the others. JonBenét had been killed inside her own home, and whether the killer was someone who slipped in unseen or someone already inside, the secrets of that house had become the prison of justice. The morning after JonBenét's body was discovered, the Boulder County coroner began the autopsy that would define the investigation. In many ways, this examination was the first moment when the case shifted from chaos to science. The autopsy stripped away the noise of ransom notes, interviews, and speculation. What remained was the silent testimony of JonBenét's own body. The report was grim. JonBenét had two distinct injuries, a massive skull fracture and strangulation by a garrote fashioned from a length of cord and a broken paintbrush handle. The fracture extended across the right side of her skull, more than 8 inches long, consistent with blunt force trauma delivered with tremendous force. Strangulation, however, was listed as the official cause of death. The coroner believed she was alive when the cord was tightened, though unconscious from the blow. The garrote itself was chilling in design. A nylon cord had been looped and twisted around a stick broken from one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrushes. It was a weapon improvised but deliberate, created not in haste but with a kind of terrible intention. The knot was complex, suggesting the killer knew how to fashion restraints. This was not the work of someone improvising in panic. It was careful, controlled, and cruel. Other details raised questions. JonBenét's wrists had been bound, but loosely, as if the restraints had been staged rather than functional. Duct tape had been placed over her mouth, though fibers indicated it had been applied after she was already dead or near death. These inconsistencies gave investigators pause. Was the crime truly what it appeared to be, or had elements been arranged to tell a misleading story? The autopsy also revealed possible signs of sexual assault. There was evidence of prior vaginal injury, though forensic pathologists debated whether it was consistent with recent assault or chronic irritation. Swabs taken revealed unidentified male DNA in her underwear, tiny traces too small at the time to identify. This single clue would fuel decades of debate, an intruder's calling card, or a red herring. Toxicology tests came back negative. No drugs or sedatives were in her system. The coroner noted food in her stomach, pineapple, likely eaten shortly before death. This detail, seemingly minor, would later become pivotal when investigators noticed a bowl of pineapple on the kitchen table. Fingerprints from Patsy and JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, Burke, were found on the bowl and spoon. That discovery opened another set of questions. Had JonBenét been awake later than her parents claimed? And if so, why wasn't that detail part of their statements? The autopsy also revealed fibers on JonBenét's clothing that matched items from within the house. Forensic technicians found traces consistent with Patsy's red sweater, as well as fibers linking the cord and duct tape to household materials. While not conclusive, the overlap between the evidence and the home environment strengthened suspicions that the crime had not been committed by an intruder, but by someone inside. Still, the DNA complicated things. The unidentified male DNA in JonBenét's clothing became a lightning rod in the case. If an intruder had been responsible, this clue could be the proof investigators needed. But skeptics argued that the trace might have been transferred during manufacturing or handling. Clothing, after all, passes through many hands before it reaches a child's dresser. Was the DNA a direct link to the killer, or an innocent contaminant? The crime scene itself compounded the confusion. The basement room where JonBenét was found was often described as difficult to locate, tucked away behind other doors. Some argued an intruder would never have known to place her there, while others pointed out that the broken basement window offered potential access. The question remained unresolved. Could an outsider have slipped in, committed the crime, and vanished without leaving footprints in the fresh snow outside? For Boulder police, the autopsy painted a picture of both brutality and calculation. The blow to the head suggested rage or desperation. The garrote, by contrast, suggested control and planning. Together, they hinted at a crime that was not impulsive but layered, a collision of violence and staging. The inconsistencies only deepened suspicions toward the family. Patsy had been the one to discover the ransom note. John had been the one to carry the body upstairs, disturbing the crime scene. Burke's prints were on the pineapple bowl, contradicting the official family account of that night. Each piece of evidence seemed to point inward, yet none could be stitched into a single narrative strong enough to prove guilt. Meanwhile, the Ramseys insisted on their innocence. In interviews, they spoke of their devastation, their confusion, their belief that an intruder had targeted their daughter. Patsy, often emotional, denied any role in writing the ransom note. Jon pushed back against the implication that wealth and status had insulated them from scrutiny. But behind the scenes, Boulder police began to narrow their focus, convinced that the answer lay not outside, but within the house itself. The autopsy was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it offered a paradox. It gave investigators facts, injuries, fibers, DNA, but those facts pointed in different directions, refusing to align into a single truth. Was the blow to the head the primary act, with strangulation staged to divert suspicion, or was the garrote the intended method, the fracture a desperate attempt to finish the crime? And above all, who had reason to kill a 6-year-old child in such a bizarre and theatrical way? As the official report was filed, detectives realized they were facing a case unlike any they had handled before. Most crimes tell a story. This one told several, each contradicting the other, each casting suspicion in a new direction. The autopsy had spoken, but it had spoken in riddles. And from that moment on, the Ramsey case would no longer be just a homicide investigation. It would become a battlefield of theories, accusations, and endless debate, an unsolved puzzle that still casts its shadow today. From the moment JonBenét's body was carried out of the basement, suspicion inside the Boulder Police Department tilted toward the family. It wasn't unusual statistically. When a child is murdered, investigators begin with the parents. But in this case, the suspicions hardened quickly, and the Ramseys soon found themselves less victims and more potential suspects. The ransom note was the first strike against them. Investigators couldn't escape the fact that it had been written inside the house. The peculiar phrasing, the length, the specific demand of $118,000, all pointed toward someone with intimate knowledge of the family. For many in law enforcement, it seemed less like the work of a stranger, and more like a staged attempt to frame an intruder. Then there was the handling of the crime scene. Patsy discovered the note. Jon discovered the body. Burke, their 9-year-old son, was said to have slept through the entire ordeal, though some officers wondered whether that was possible in a house so full of panic. Each action the family took, or failed to take, was scrutinized. Patsy's 911 call was replayed again and again, analysts straining to hear background noises that might reveal hidden truths. Some swore they heard Burke's faint voice. Others dismissed it as static. Interviews with the family only deepened the divide. Patsy, dressed in full makeup during some sessions, was emotional, often breaking down. Critics argued her tears seemed rehearsed. Supporters said she was a grieving mother judged too harshly. Jon remained composed, defensive when pressed, unwilling to accept the idea that police suspected his family. Their contrasting demeanors fueled speculation. Were they hiding something, or simply responding to grief in different ways? Forensic experts pored over handwriting samples. While no one could definitively say Patsy had written the ransom note, some analysts leaned toward her as a possible match. The findings, though inconclusive, added weight to police suspicion. At the same time, DNA evidence from JonBenét's clothing suggested an unknown male presence. To outsiders, this seemed like proof of an intruder. To Boulder police, it was contamination, either from manufacturing or handling of the garments. The evidence was, frustratingly, both damning and dismissible depending on perspective. Burke, the quiet 9-year-old brother, became the subject of hushed theories. The pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, the fingerprints on the kitchen bowl, and the timing of her injuries all led some to speculate that he may have struck her in a fit of childish anger, with his parents staging the rest to protect him. There was no direct evidence, only circumstantial whispers, but the theory clung to the case for years, resurfacing in documentaries and television specials. The Ramseys consistently denied it, calling the idea grotesque. The media storm amplified everything. By early 1997, JonBenét's face was on every magazine cover. Her pageant photos splashed across television screens. To some, she symbolized innocence lost. To others, the Ramseys' display of her in makeup and costumes suggested a darker dynamic. The family's wealth and prominence made them targets, accused of trying to manipulate the investigation with their influence. The more they insisted on their innocence, the more critics pointed to that insistence as guilt. Boulder police clashed with the Ramseys at every turn. The family hired attorneys early, refusing to be questioned without representation. They brought in private investigators, challenging the police narrative and hinting at corruption or incompetence in the department. The Ramseys even held a nationally televised interview, pleading their innocence directly to the public. For many, the move was bold and desperate. For others, it was strategic theater. The result was a case divided into camps. One camp, the police and their supporters, believed the Ramseys were responsible, staging the crime to deflect suspicion. The other, the family's defenders and private investigators, argued passionately for the intruder theory, citing the DNA, the open window, and the possibility of a predator targeting JonBenét. The divide wasn't just professional, it cut through the public, splitting households, sparking debates in diners and living rooms, and fueling endless speculation. The fracture inside the investigation soon became paralysis. Boulder police struggled to build a case strong enough to prosecute. The district attorney's office, skeptical of the evidence against the family, hesitated to press charges. Years passed with little progress, each side entrenched. The Ramseys sued media outlets for defamation, winning settlements. Police remained convinced the truth lay within the house. The DA's office leaned toward an outside suspect. The conflict turned the case from a tragedy into a circus of accusations and counter-accusations. Meanwhile, the public's fascination only grew. The more the Ramseys spoke, the more polarized opinion became. Patsy's tearful interviews, John's stern rebuttals, Burke's silence, every word, every gesture, every absence, became evidence for or against them in the court of public opinion. By the end of the 1990s, the JonBenét Ramsey case had become more than a crime. It was a cultural phenomenon. The family was scrutinized not just as suspects but as symbols. To some, they embodied the facade of American privilege, hiding darker secrets. To others, they were victims of a rush to judgment, their grief exploited by a relentless media. And through it all, one truth remained unchanged. JonBenét was dead, and her killer had not been found. The case had become about theories, factions, and reputations, but justice for a 6-year-old girl was still missing. While Boulder police leaned heavily toward the family as suspects, not everyone agreed. From the earliest days of the investigation, there were those who believed firmly that an intruder had entered the Ramsey home, committed the crime, and vanished into the night. This theory, controversial and often dismissed, would come to define one half of the debate, a counterweight to the suspicion that gripped the Ramseys. The evidence for an intruder began with the basement window. One pane had been broken, and John Ramsey admitted he had previously broken it himself to get inside the house after locking himself out. Detectives found the window ajar on the day of the crime. Critics noted that dust and cobwebs suggested it hadn't been disturbed recently, but intruder theorists argued it was still the most plausible point of entry. The Ramsey house was large, with multiple doors and obscure basement access points, plenty of places, they said, for someone to slip in unnoticed. Then there was the unidentified male DNA, found in JonBenét's underwear, and later confirmed on additional items of her clothing. It was a clue that Boulder police struggled to explain. Contamination from manufacturing? Possibly. But as DNA science improved, the persistence of this unknown profile became harder to dismiss. If not contamination, then it meant another male had contact with JonBenét's clothing, someone not in the family, not in the house. To many, this was the strongest piece of evidence pointing to an intruder. There were also reports from neighbors. One claimed to have seen a strange man lingering near the Ramsey house in the days before Christmas. Another recalled hearing a scream the night of December 25th, though her testimony was inconsistent. Police found a suitcase near the basement window, positioned in a way that some thought might have been intended as a step for someone climbing in or out. Each of these details was circumstantial, but together they built a picture of possibility. Proponents of the intruder theory also pointed to the ransom note itself. To them, its bizarre language wasn't evidence of staging. It was evidence of an outsider, perhaps unhinged, drawing on pop culture and fantasy. The specific ransom amount, they argued, could have been known by someone with access to John Ramsey's business dealings, not necessarily the family themselves. The note's length, while unusual, could have been the product of a nervous criminal improvising under stress. Several suspects emerged over the years. One was a neighborhood drifter with a history of breaking into homes. Another was a local electrician who had worked in the Ramsey house before. Still others included convicted sex offenders who lived nearby. None were conclusively tied to the crime, but each represented a thread investigators tugged at repeatedly. The most infamous of these suspects was John Mark Carr, a schoolteacher arrested in 2006, after confessing to JonBenét's murder. His confession initially stunned the world. He claimed to have been present that night, described elements of the crime, and declared it was a love affair gone wrong. But his story unraveled quickly. His DNA didn't match. His timeline didn't align. Investigators concluded he had fabricated his confession for attention, and he was dismissed as a suspect. Still, his bizarre involvement reinforced the enduring pull of the intruder theory. Supporters of this theory argued passionately that Boulder police had been blinded by tunnel vision. By focusing on the Ramseys, they ignored other avenues. The mishandling of the crime scene, they said, ensured that crucial evidence of an outsider could have been erased. The unidentified DNA, the open window, the suitcase, the neighbor sightings, all were dismissed too quickly, sacrificed to a narrative that made the family the easiest suspects. The Ramseys themselves leaned into the intruder theory. In interviews, John and Patsy insisted their innocence, pointing to the DNA as their vindication. They argued they had been victimized twice, first by the loss of their daughter, and second by the relentless suspicion of the police. Their private investigators explored alternative suspects, building dossiers on drifters, neighbors, and known offenders. In the public eye, the Ramseys became symbols of resistance to a flawed investigation. Still, critics remained unconvinced. If an intruder had committed the crime, why linger long enough to write a 3-page ransom note? Why leave JonBenét's body inside the house, where discovery was inevitable? Why risk exposure in a home full of people? The logistics strained belief, and though DNA pointed outward, skeptics countered that it could not explain the fibers, the handwriting, or the inconsistencies in the family's statements. The case remained a tug-of-war. For every piece of evidence supporting an intruder, there was another pointing back toward the family. For every expert who said the DNA was conclusive, another dismissed it as incidental. For every neighbor who reported suspicious activity, another insisted the Ramseys' behavior was the real red flag. What made the intruder theory endure was not just evidence but possibility. It preserved the idea that JonBenét's death was the work of an outsider, a predator who slipped into the house, struck, and vanished. It offered the Ramseys an explanation that freed them from guilt, and it kept alive the haunting notion that somewhere out there, in Boulder or beyond, a killer had walked away unseen. But like everything in this case, the intruder theory was never definitive. It was a story built on shadows, on fragments of evidence that could mean everything or nothing. And as the years passed, it became less a theory to solve the crime and more a dividing line, a symbol of the case's refusal to yield a single truth. From the moment JonBenét Ramsey's photograph hit the front page of the Boulder Daily Camera on December 27, 1996, the case was no longer just a local tragedy, it was national. Within days, her face, smiling in sequined gowns and tiaras from child beauty pageants, was everywhere. Television anchors introduced her name with solemn voices. Magazines plastered her image in bold colors. Tabloids screamed theories across supermarket aisles. By the first week of January, JonBenét was not just a victim, she was a symbol, and her family's life was under a microscope so bright it blinded everyone involved. The media's fascination was immediate and ferocious. On one level, it was understandable. The crime had all the elements of a narrative that gripped viewers: a wealthy family in an affluent neighborhood, a ransom note dripping with bizarre language, a child beauty queen whose carefully posed photos made her both familiar and unsettling in the public eye, and a mystery that seemed to generate more questions than answers. The story was irresistible. Television crews descended on Boulder, turning quiet streets into broadcast backdrops. Reporters camped outside the Ramsey home, microphones and cameras ready to capture any glimpse of the grieving family. Satellite trucks lined the block. Neighbors were interviewed relentlessly, asked to share suspicions, observations, or rumors. Privacy dissolved almost overnight. The Ramsey home, once decorated for Christmas, became a fortress of blinds drawn tight against the flashing cameras. The pageant photos became a lightning rod. Networks showed endless loops of JonBenét performing in gowns, makeup, and crowns, spliced against footage of crime scene tape. To many, it was an image of innocence lost, a heartbreaking reminder of a childhood cut short. But to others, the photographs were disturbing, casting the Ramseys as parents who sexualized their daughter, inviting danger into her life. That narrative stuck, fueled not by evidence but by imagery. The photographs became part of the prosecution in the court of public opinion. Talk shows and tabloids poured gasoline on the fire. Every week, new theories emerged. Some pointed fingers at John Ramsey, suggesting a father's dark secret. Others accused Patsy, painting her as a mother under pressure, snapping in rage. Still others whispered about Burke, the 9-year-old brother, speculating that the family had orchestrated a cover-up to protect him. No theory was too wild for publication. With each headline, the case became less about JonBenét and more about the spectacle surrounding her. The Ramseys, stunned by the scrutiny, tried to fight back. They hired attorneys, public relations advisors, and private investigators. They gave interviews, most famously a CNN appearance in which they pleaded for the public to find their daughter's killer. Patsy, in a bright red sweater, clasped John's hand as she insisted on their innocence. But critics seized on their words and mannerisms, dissecting every blink, every inflection, every gesture. To some, their performance seemed defensive, rehearsed. To others, it was the raw grief of parents cornered by suspicion. The media circus divided America. One camp believed firmly that the Ramseys were guilty, that their wealth and status insulated them from justice. Another camp saw them as victims twice over, their tragedy exploited by sensational headlines. The debate was fierce, not just in newsrooms but in living rooms, workplaces and classrooms. Everyone had an opinion, everyone felt invested. Documentaries soon followed. Networks aired special reports, stringing together interviews, police footage, and speculation. Each new program promised revelations, but delivered mostly recycled theories, yet the ratings were undeniable. JonBenét's case had become entertainment as much as tragedy, a saga that people consumed as eagerly as fiction. For Boulder police, the media frenzy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept public attention on the case, generating tips and pressure to solve it. On the other hand, it compromised the investigation. Potential witnesses read coverage and tailored their stories. Evidence leaks became headlines before detectives could act. The police department, already criticized for mishandling the crime scene, now faced ridicule from a national audience. Their every move was second-guessed in real time. The Ramseys' relationship with the press soured quickly. They sued tabloids for defamation, winning settlements, but the damage was already done. Patsy, in particular, bore the brunt of suspicion in print. Articles painted her as a perfectionist, a former beauty queen projecting her ambitions onto her daughter, and potentially unraveling under the pressure. Whether accurate or not, the narrative stuck. In the eyes of many Americans, Patsy Ramsey became the prime suspect long before police could prove anything. As the years passed, the case remained a staple of true crime coverage. Every anniversary brought new headlines, new retrospectives, new debates. Theories were rehashed, suspects reintroduced, and experts paraded across television screens. Even after Patsy Ramsey's death in 2006, her name continued to anchor documentaries and articles, proof of how deeply suspicion had fused with the family's identity. The sheer weight of media attention transformed the case from an investigation into a cultural phenomenon. It wasn't just about who killed JonBenét anymore. It was about America's fascination with wealth, innocence, and scandal. She became a symbol of vulnerability, and her family became characters in a never-ending drama. The case was no longer confined to Boulder. It belonged to the entire nation. But while the cameras flashed and theories multiplied, one haunting fact remained. The killer had not been caught. The spectacle may have kept the story alive, but it also buried the truth beneath layers of noise. The media ensured JonBenét would never be forgotten. Yet, in doing so, it may have made it impossible to ever find her justice. As the media storm raged, the actual investigation began to splinter. By the late 1990s, the JonBenét Ramsey case was less a unified effort to find a killer, and more a battlefield between factions. On one side stood the Boulder Police Department, convinced the answers lay within the Ramsey household. On the other stood the district attorney's office, increasingly skeptical of the family-focused approach and open to the intruder theory. This internal conflict would define the case for years, leaving it paralyzed while the world watched. Boulder police dug in their heels. Their detectives argued that the crime scene showed clear signs of staging. The ransom note, written inside the house, was Exhibit A. The garrote and duct tape, inconsistent restraints, were Exhibit B. Add to that, the family's unusual behavior. Patsy calling friends to the house before police arrived. John carrying the body upstairs, and they believed the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. In their eyes, no intruder could have pulled off such a crime without leaving more obvious signs. The district attorney's office, however, saw it differently. Led by Alex Hunter, the DA insisted there wasn't enough evidence to indict the Ramseys. Hunter's team leaned heavily on the unidentified male DNA, arguing that it couldn't be ignored. They pointed out the lack of footprints in the snow outside, but also noted that an intruder could have entered before the snowfall or through an unlocked door. To them, the case was murky, and rushing to accuse the parents risked a wrongful prosecution. The rift between police and prosecutors became public, spilling into press conferences and interviews. Detectives accused the DA of caving to the Ramsey family's influence and wealth. The DA's office accused the police of tunnel vision and sloppy work. The result was a stalemate. Two agencies working at cross purposes, each undermining the other. Instead of clarity, the case sank deeper into confusion. Meanwhile, the Ramseys tried to live under the crushing weight of suspicion. Patsy and John continued to assert their innocence, appearing on television, publishing a book titled The Death of Innocence, and hiring private investigators to pursue leads police had dismissed. They accused the authorities of fixating on them, while the real killer walked free. For many Americans, however, their efforts only deepened the divide. To some, their public campaign was proof of desperation. To others, it was the courage of grieving parents fighting back. Burke, the quiet center of speculation, retreated from public life. He rarely appeared in media coverage, shielded by his parents from the relentless spotlight. Still, the theories about him persisted, fueled by the pineapple evidence and whispers of sibling jealousy. Without hard evidence, the theory remained speculation, but it haunted the case, resurfacing whenever new documentaries aired. By 1999, pressure mounted for the case to reach some kind of resolution. A grand jury was convened in Boulder, tasked with reviewing the evidence and determining whether charges should be filed. For months, witnesses were called, documents presented, and theories dissected. Then, quietly, the jury adjourned without a public indictment. At the time, it seemed like the case had stalled completely. It wasn't until years later, in 2013, that the truth emerged. The grand jury had actually voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse, resulting in death. The DA, Alex Hunter, declined to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. This revelation ignited outrage. For critics of the Ramseys, it was proof that they had been protected by privilege. For defenders, it was confirmation that the evidence was too thin to move forward. For JonBenét, it meant justice was deferred once again. The early 2000s brought more of the same, stalemate and speculation. Each anniversary of her death brought new headlines, new retrospectives, and new frustration. Patsy Ramsey, battling ovarian cancer, gave interviews in which she insisted she wanted to live long enough to see her daughter's killer brought to justice. But in 2006, she passed away at the age of 49, never seeing resolution. John Ramsey, now a widower, carried the case forward alone. That same year, the bizarre saga of John Mark Carr reignited the world's attention. His false confession was sensational, but ultimately meaningless. Still, it highlighted the vacuum left by years of investigative paralysis. The hunger for closure was so great that even a fabricated confession became front-page news. Through the 2000s and 2010s, the stalemate persisted. Boulder police clung to their suspicions of the family. Successive district attorneys refused to file charges without stronger evidence. DNA testing improved, but the unidentified male profile remained elusive, matching no one in databases. The case was stuck, circling endlessly between theories that seemed simultaneously possible and implausible. For the public, the years of stalemate only deepened the fascination. JonBenét's face remained on magazine covers. Television specials rehashed the same evidence with dramatic music and slow-motion reenactments. Podcasts dissected every detail, from the handwriting analysis to the pineapple bowl. Theories multiplied: a botched kidnapping, a jealous sibling, an obsessed intruder, a parent pushed to the breaking point. Each theory had believers, each theory had holes, and none could close the case. By the end of the second decade, the case had become less about evidence and more about endurance. It endured because it was unsolved, because it had no resolution, because it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, privilege, policing, and media. JonBenét's story had become timeless, not because of answers, but because of the lack of them. And so, year after year, the case remained frozen. Police files thickened with new notes. District attorneys issued cautious statements. Documentaries promised revelations but delivered the same contradictions. And through it all, JonBenét's name echoed, a reminder of a 6-year-old girl whose life ended in mystery, and a case that seemed destined never to rest. As the case entered the 2010s, technology that had once seemed like science fiction began reshaping the landscape of cold case investigations. Across the country, decades-old crimes were being solved through advances in DNA analysis and forensic genealogy. Killers long thought untouchable were unmasked. Victims once nameless were identified. Each new breakthrough brought the same question to the people of Boulder, Colorado. If science could close those cases, could it finally unlock the mystery of JonBenét Ramsey? The unidentified male DNA found in JonBenét's clothing had haunted investigators from the very beginning. In 1997, it was little more than a trace, too small to do much with. But as testing improved, the profile grew clearer. By the early 2000s, analysts could confirm it came from a male unrelated to the Ramseys. To family defenders, this was vindication, a biological fingerprint of an intruder. To skeptics, it was an artifact of contamination, perhaps deposited during the manufacturing process of the underwear. Both sides clung to their interpretations, and the debate raged. But science did not stand still. By the late 2010s, techniques like touch DNA, the ability to isolate genetic material from the lightest contact, had become standard. Forensic genealogy, the method that cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018, offered a tantalizing possibility. By uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases, investigators could search for partial matches among distant relatives, then painstakingly reconstruct family trees until they arrived at a suspect. It was time-consuming and resource-heavy, but it had worked in cases even older than JonBenét's. In 2019, the Boulder Police Department quietly announced that new DNA testing was underway. They were working with state labs and private forensic firms, hoping to use advanced sequencing to wring every possible clue out of the degraded samples. The announcement reignited public interest. Headlines blared, "New DNA tests could solve JonBenét Ramsey case." For the first time in years, the case seemed to move from stalemate to momentum. Behind the scenes, genealogists traced lines of possibility. Every time a partial match appeared, it meant a distant relative could be identified. That relative's family tree could then be built out, branching toward potential suspects. But it was grueling work, requiring access to birth records, death certificates, obituaries, census data. A single branch could take months to map. Still, the process represented something the case had not had in years, hope rooted in science rather than speculation. The Ramseys, too, embraced the promise of DNA. John Ramsey gave interviews urging investigators to use every tool available, insisting the truth lay not in theories about his family, but in the science waiting to be unlocked. For him, the DNA profile was more than evidence. It was his family's redemption. If science could match it, the cloud of suspicion that had lingered for decades might finally lift. Yet even DNA brought its own complications. The samples were limited, degraded by time and handling. Each test consumed material, leaving less for future analysis. The stakes were enormous. If mishandled, the last hope of solving the case could be destroyed. Boulder authorities moved cautiously, sometimes frustrating the public with their slow pace, but investigators insisted patience was essential. As years passed, updates came in fits and starts. Some reports suggested new leads had been generated, only for them to fade under scrutiny. Others hinted at breakthroughs just around the corner, but no arrests followed. The DNA, while powerful, was not a magic key. It was a tool that required context, corroboration, and luck. Without a close match in databases, the trail could stretch on indefinitely. Meanwhile, media once again amplified the science. True crime specials showcased genealogy experts drawing sprawling family trees across whiteboards. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to the question of whether DNA would solve the Ramsey case. The fascination never waned. Each time technology advanced, JonBenét's name returned to headlines, her photograph once again staring out from screens and magazines. By the early 2020s, dozens of cold cases had been solved nationwide through forensic genealogy. Some were as old as JonBenét's, some older. In each case, the announcement came with a mix of shock and relief. For Boulder residents, it was bittersweet. Each solved case elsewhere underscored the fact that JonBenét's killer still walked free. The expectation grew heavier. If DNA could bring justice to others, why not here? Officials remained guarded. Boulder police released statements acknowledging the DNA work but refused to comment on specifics. They cited the ongoing investigation, the sensitivity of genealogy, and the risk of jeopardizing future prosecutions. Critics accused them of secrecy, supporters urged patience. The cycle repeated, year after year. But there was no denying the power of science to keep hope alive. Where once the case seemed trapped in stalemate, DNA offered a path forward. Even if slow, even if uncertain, it represented progress. And for a case defined by contradictions, stagnation, and suspicion, progress itself was rare and precious. As of today, the DNA mystery remains unsolved. The profile exists, preserved and tested, waiting for its match. It may connect tomorrow, next year, or decades from now, or it may remain forever, an echo, a clue without a name. But it is there, a fingerprint in silence, the last whisper of a killer who has hidden too long. For the Ramsey case, science has become both promise and purgatory. It promises answers, redemption, and closure. But until the day a name is spoken, it also traps the case in waiting. And so, more than 25 years later, the hope of justice rests not on confessions or eyewitnesses, but on strands of DNA too small to see, threads of truth waiting for the world to catch up. More than a quarter of a century has passed since that cold December morning in Boulder. For some cases, time softens memory, details fade, and the story recedes quietly into history, but not this one. The JonBenét Ramsey case has only grown larger with time, a story retold again and again on television, in books, on podcasts, in endless online forums. It is a case that refuses to rest, a mystery that will not go silent. Today, JonBenét's name carries weight far beyond the walls of her family's home. She has become a symbol, a case study in investigative failure, media obsession, and cultural fascination. Her story is taught in criminology courses. Her photographs are instantly recognizable worldwide. Even people born years after her death know her name. In that sense, JonBenét has become immortal, forever frozen, as the 6-year-old beauty queen, whose smile hides a tragedy no one has solved. But beneath the spectacle, the human reality remains. JonBenét was a child. She was not a headline, not a documentary subject, not a debate. She was a little girl who loved Christmas, who played with her brother, who sang in pageants and dressed in sparkly gowns because her mother thought she was destined for the stage. She had favorite toys, favorite foods, moments of joy that were abruptly stolen. The endless swirl of theories sometimes obscures the most important fact. She was a daughter, a sister, a child whose life ended far too soon. For Jon Ramsey, still alive today, the case is not history but an open wound. He has carried the weight of suspicion and grief longer than most could endure. He lost his wife Patsy to cancer in 2006, still under a cloud of public suspicion she never lived to see lifted. He has defended his son Burke against speculation that shadowed his childhood and adult life, and he continues to push for answers, urging authorities to release evidence to private labs with the resources to unlock the DNA mystery. For him, justice is not about theories. It is about finally knowing who killed his daughter and why. For investigators, the case is a constant reminder of mistakes that cannot be undone. The mishandled crime scene, the contaminated evidence, the internal feuds between police and prosecutors. These errors ensured the case would never be simple. Every officer who has inherited the file has inherited the weight of those early missteps. They know the truth may still be there, buried in the evidence, but buried so deep it may never be found. For the public, the fascination endures because the case embodies contradiction. Every clue points in two directions at once. The ransom note looks staged, yet its details hint at outside knowledge. The DNA points to an intruder, yet the fibers and handwriting point to the home. The injuries suggest rage, yet the garrote suggests planning. Nothing fits neatly, and so the case has become less about finding a solution, and more about living with uncertainty. Even now, new documentaries and podcasts reframe the case for fresh audiences. Some claim to have uncovered overlooked evidence. Others recycle the same theories with slicker production. Each promises answers. None deliver them. And yet, people watch, listen, and debate, because something about this case will not let go. It is not just the mystery, it is the haunting sense that justice slipped away, that a child's story was lost in the noise. In Boulder, the Ramsey house still stands. It has changed owners over the years, remodeled, repainted, but never rid of its past. For many, it is a landmark of unease, a reminder that tragedy can hide behind even the most elegant doors. Neighbors still remember the swarm of reporters, the flashing lights, the endless speculation that turned their quiet streets into a global stage. The house is part of the story now, as much as the ransom note, the pineapple, or the garrote. So why does this case refuse to rest? Perhaps because it reflects something larger than itself. It is about innocence lost, not just JonBenét's, but society's belief that wealth, status, and law enforcement could guarantee safety and truth. It is about the fallibility of institutions, the way mistakes can snowball until they bury justice completely. It is about the power of media to shape a narrative so forcefully that truth itself becomes secondary. And it is about the human need for answers in the face of silence. Will science eventually solve the case? Perhaps. The DNA profile remains the single strongest lead, waiting for the day when databases expand enough to catch a match. Genealogists still hold out hope that one distant cousin, one overlooked branch of a family tree, will finally point to the killer. Technology has made miracles before, it may do so again, but for now, the truth remains elusive. And so, JonBenét's story continues to echo, a case without resolution, a child without justice, a family forever divided between suspicion and grief, a nation still debating what happened in a basement in Boulder on Christmas night. The title of this story is not just a phrase, it is the truth. The JonBenét Ramsey case is a mystery that won't rest, and perhaps that is its legacy, not just the horror of the crime, but the haunting reminder that some stories never end. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime history, not because of what is known, but because of what is not. A child was murdered inside her own home, and more than 25 years later, no one has been convicted. That silence has become its own haunting truth. From the moment her body was found in the basement, the case fractured into contradictions. The ransom note pointed in one direction, the autopsy in another. DNA suggested an intruder, while fibers and handwriting suggested someone inside the house. Theories piled on top of theories, until the truth was no longer clear but buried under speculation, accusation, and doubt. Each clue seemed to whisper two stories at once, and no one could decide which one to believe. The media transformed JonBenét into more than a victim. Her pageant photos, replayed endlessly, created a spectacle that overshadowed the child herself. Her family became characters in a drama scripted by tabloids and cable news, accused or defended depending on the headline. The public grew obsessed, not only with who killed JonBenét, but with what the case revealed about privilege, police work and the power of perception. For the Ramseys, the years have been a prison of suspicion. Patsy never lived to see her name cleared, passing away still under a cloud. John has fought for decades to redirect the case toward the unknown intruder he believes is responsible. Burke, once just a child himself, has carried the shadow of speculation into adulthood. They remain trapped, unable to escape the gravity of a story that became bigger than their lives. For investigators, the case is a lesson in failure. The contaminated crime scene, the internal feuds between police and prosecutors, the missed opportunities, all ensured that solving JonBenét's murder would never be straightforward. Each new detective who inherits the file inherits the frustration of knowing the answers might have been lost that very first day. And yet, the case refuses to fade. Advances in DNA keep the hope alive. Genealogy has solved crimes even older, proving that silence is not always permanent. Somewhere in that profile of unidentified male DNA may lie the key to unlocking the truth. It may take one more breakthrough, one more match, one more moment of science catching up to sorrow. Until then, the case waits. Perhaps that is why the JonBenét Ramsey case still grips us. It is not just about a child's murder. It is about our own inability to let go of questions that matter. Who killed her? Why was she taken? Why has justice been denied for so long? These are questions that linger, echoing through time, refusing to rest. And so, the story remains open. JonBenét Ramsey, 6 years old, frozen in memory, immortalized by mystery, continues to remind us that some crimes never fade, some truths never surface, and some cases will haunt us forever.